The following is a patron-only project. Being that the government, academic, and religious institutions still aren't offering grant programs for the purpose of exposing them, I rely on the generosity and reciprocity of those who see the value in and have benefited from what the Obry Project is doing and will continue to do. All of your support is profoundly meaningful and helpful. Thank you. And now, The Dead Sea Scrolls and Modern Scholarship by Solomon Zeitlin, a reading with commentary. Part 1. This book was written or attributed to an author by the name of Solomon Zeitlin, an Ashkenazi Jew, and it was published in, the copyright is 1956 by the Jewish Quarterly Review. There's a couple of things that I want to address about this. First off, its nearness to the alleged discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves in Qumran, near, of course, the Dead Sea. That's where they get their names. By a random Arab shepherd boy. Now, everything about this story is problematic, of course. What was a Arab shepherd boy doing, leading his goats to a place such as that? The Dead Sea, the whole area around the Dead Sea, as well as the valley, what they call the Gor, G-H-O-R, or the valley that extends for anywhere from 1 to 4 miles around the Jordan, mostly on the west side, because the east side of the Jordan is mostly a buildup of rock. It's sort of just bluffs on the east side. And then the most of the land is much higher on the east side of the Jordan. So there's some areas of valley there too. It's called the Gor, G-H-O-R, colloquially. And the whole area around the Dead Sea, Qumran, is really some of the hottest places in the world. Inhospitable. Anybody who's traveled there, who was even a little bit honest, goes into great detail about the terrible oppressiveness of the heat. So hot. And of course, with the Dead Sea and all, it's so humid. Well, you have the Sea of Galilee, and then you have the creek they call Jordan, which sort of winds its way down to the Dead Sea. Mostly of extraordinarily salty body of water. And nothing lives in there. They say it's because the wind doesn't blow, they call it the Dead Sea, but either way, no wind, nothing living, it's dead. And you can't really put vessels out in there. They would get, first off, any oars that you tried using, they would get crusted very quickly. There was, in fact, 1 or 2 of the early purported explorers in the early 1800s sent from either Britain or America that logged actually going down the Jordan Creek and winding up in the Dead Sea. They did not last long because they really could not keep their vessels from really getting crusted up really fast with all of the salt and minerals that are in it. And if they felt like, there was a couple of them that accidentally fell in there, and they said, just being in there for a brief period of time made their skin sting from the extreme salinity, and so on and so forth. Okay, so even if the water from the Dead Sea were to seep into all of the surrounding soil, which is mostly rock, sand, it would not enrich it. This is the same case in the Gor Valley. Most people don't really realize that the what they call the Sea of Galilee or Tiberias, it is also brackish. And a lot of that water that comes down from it is already brackish. So even if you're farming in the Gor Valley, and there's only a very small amount of crops that will really grow there and not really well. And you're irrigating. The water that you're going to be giving your plants is still a brackish water, even before it reaches the Dead Sea. So the idea that a shepherd boy would be so foolish as to think leading some goats to the Dead Sea area to find something to graze on, it doesn't seem highly likely. Not saying he couldn't find some patches here and there of something that the goats might want to eat, but not much. The pickings would be slim, and there's a lot, and I mean a lot of other places that he would want to go to besides that area. And there's questions of preservation. Yes, the desert is quite dry. The Dead Sea area is not. The Dead Sea area is not only hot, but it's oftentimes described as being extremely humid. So there's some problems there too. And then there's the after story of this alleged shepherd boy who they say found a number of these very important scrolls, and then there's all the scroll fragments and such, and how he treated them. They say that he hung some of them on poles for some time before apparently he found somebody who was interested in them, and then they changed hands a few times. All of this, of course, taking place at a very opportune time in history, just before the NSDAP or Nazis came into power in Germany. Therefore, in Germany and in all the areas that they would occupy thereafter, they would make it very conducive for the Ashkenazim and other gypsies called Jews to move to Palestine, though nearly none of them wanted to. This is not a place that any of them really wanted to go to. And, furthermore, if you consider all of the other details in everything that happened, this was there were many reasons, I believe, for the happening of World War II. One of them being to identify this people they call the Ashkenazim, or a lot of these gypsies, as Jews, make them sort of like the poster children for, Jews and Judaism, but to also kill off a certain demographic in territories that were occupied either by Germany or then the Soviet Union or allies, France, England, America, so on. So a really strange time for these things to be discovered, and equally as strange that this Zeitlin would, through this Jewish Quarterly Review, would release these series of articles, and then of course this book based on them so soon after, especially given the fact that it's being released by the Jewish Quarterly Review. And so, naturally it reminds me of a saying that's attributed mostly to, I believe, Lenin, could be Stalin, because I get some of their quotes mixed up. Either way, I'm not sure that these were necessarily the guys, either one, that came up with this concept, because I believe it was being used far before this and far before them and their regimes, alleged regimes, allegedly them leading these regimes, which is the best way for us to control the opposition, is to lead it ourselves. And here we've got this book, The Dead Sea Scrolls in Modern Scholarship by Solomon Zeitlin, being published by the Jewish Quarterly Review. So keep that in mind. It does, however, still contain a number of facts and a lot of information that we still want to look at, we still want to know. And unfortunately, there are some caveats here. One is that he will be using a lot of assumptions. By that, I mean accepted bodies of literature that, of course, I would claim should not be trusted as authentic or historic or absolute in the sense of scholarly absolutes, like Masoretic grammar or anything that employs the Masorah, but he does go a little bit beyond some of that, which that constitutes a lot of the material that makes this book worth hearing, worth reading, and worth considering, even with those factors that I just went over. And that's the thing with just about any book there is. I don't know of a book. I don't own a book, except, maybe a few that aren't in English that need to be translated, in which I would say I think the author, whether I entirely agree with them or not on all the points they make, are coming from a place of sincerity and trustworthiness. Even if we still have to consider maybe some sources or, maybe some things they use as strengths to their arguments or not, trustworthiness, sincerity. This is always key in whether or not we can trust an author. And I am going to tell you sincerely, I have very few books that have to do with anything of importance: history, language, geography, culture, politics, happenings of all of those things, and especially the Bible and anything related to that I would call trustworthy. Books that you can read in a relaxed state of mind, in the sense that you don't constantly have to try to distill these and spot bad arguments, whether they be deliberate or not. It's sad, but that really is the state of literature and epistemology today. And this is why I will not do readings anymore. I had the sponsor reading page there, and some took advantage of that, and I really appreciate those people for doing that. I will not just read a book like that anymore. Can't be done. We always have to be unfortunately, always have to be on our guard when it comes to anything, any information that's being pumped out by the establishment organs, and that is all media, all forms of purported education, all forms of purported old documents allegedly proving many things. We always have to be on our guards, and it's got to be one of the most horrible states to live in. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to approach everything with our guard up, ready to critique, to ask questions about, to be incredulous over, to criticize. I think that's the only really responsible way to approach these things. So with that being said, let me just tell you a few things that I haven't told you about this book besides the title and the copyright date and who published it, the Jewish Quarterly Review. It consists of 15 chapters. The war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Don't get thrown by that. It's not an uber spiritual sort of thing necessarily. The Thanksgiving hymns, the so-called letters of Bar Kokhba, phylacteries, other finds, scrolls purchased by the Hebrew University, the Zadokite fragments, and explanation is desideratum, a few little fun Latin words in here, the Essenes and the Sadducees, paleography, archaeology, and propaganda, distortions and falsifications, the beginnings of Christianity and the Hebrew scrolls, where is the fifth scroll, Qumran, Cave 1, recent literature, the mystery of the discovery of the Hebrew scrolls, and facsimiles. Now, one of the chapters that caught my eye in the first place regarding this was chapter 8, Paleography, Archaeology, and Propaganda. Now, the fun thing is, whether an author means to, as I said, to lead the opposition or what. For instance, another book that I have that was very instructive was Facts on the Ground by Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who is a half white, half Arab woman who is a professor at the women's branch of Columbia University on the East Coast of America. I tried to contact her multiple times about that book because I had read a lot of articles that were very threatening towards her, as far as scholarly threatening, like losing her tenure. She ought to be, because what did she do? She called into question the authenticity of the purported facts of archaeology regarding Palestine. That's all she did. And in fact, the book was so dry, it was quite difficult to get through because she really wasn't using sort of inflammatory language that, for one thing, can entertain a reader. It's engaging is what it is, because a lot of that inflammatory language it can oftentimes be very funny because it's being sarcastic and it's showing us things in a sarcastic way. It's the reason that many people who approach these sort of subjects do use sarcasm. It's why I use sarcasm, to try to make a point, to try to connect with people, because I know when it comes to subjects that you might be passionate about, very interested in the least, you're going to have a vested interest in it, mentally, emotionally. And these things help to connect. Her book was very dry on that level. I mean, the last thing you could say is that it was somehow inflammatory. All it was showing the facts, like the title said. She even used a lot of those assumptions, like what was Iron Age, this, that, and the other. What was Bronze Age, this, that, and the other. You understand? She used assumptions pretty much regarding names of places and things like that. And she still showed the problems with the archaeological quote-unquote finds in and around Palestine. Is she controlled opposition? She may be. But the thing is, she had to, in her book, for it to gain any ground with people who might be, let's say, part of the BDS movement, those sorts of people, boycott, divest, and sanction. These are basically just people who believe that the Jews are infringing upon the rights of the Palestinians over in Palestine, and that may be very, very true. That would heavily be her audience. A lot of them are academics. The academics are the ones who are mostly leading that kind of movement. So the thing is, she has to include a lot of this technical talk regarding these disciplines, specifically like archaeology. And that was really some of the most positive and productive parts about her book. She had to go into these things and illustrate the problems with the assumptions of archaeology, which virtually no one else, I've looked and looked and looked, virtually no other archaeological scholars or academics want to talk about those serious problems with just the presumptions, the assumptions that are used by archaeology in order to come to the conclusions that archaeology comes to. So that's what I'm saying. Even these works that are probably controlled opposition, when you look at all the factors, put them all together, they still have to have a certain degree of credibility, which means they have to show us things that normally no author, like accredited academic author, is going to come out and say, hey, I just wrote a book all about how deceptive archaeology as a practice and a so-called discipline are. I just wrote a book on how deceptive all of the assumptions surrounding the Masorah used on the Hebrew Old Testament is. I just wrote a book on the problems of dating the Septuagint with the Masoretic text, and the Septuagint being dated as 1,500 years before the Masoretic text, which actually I covered in the first hour or so of bringing it all together. That might have been one of the most valuable portions of bringing it all together. In fact, I think really just the things that were extremely problematic was still my view on the Jews at the time and my view on where geographically the kingdom of Yun was and who they were in that. But not to get sidetracked on that. So let's begin where we should, which is in the introduction. An eminent archaeologist says that the battle in dating the Dead Sea Scrolls has at times attained the status of a veritable guerre des savants, or war of scholars. It is an outstanding chapter in the history of learning, in some ways without parallel. Indeed, it fell upon me to fire the first shot in this war. To have a full understanding of this logomachy, that being a dispute over words or a battle of words, this logomachy among the scholars, I set forth the following causes and underlying reasons. In 1948, a worldwide sensation was created by the supposed discovery by Bedouin of ancient scrolls in a cave near the Dead Sea. These scrolls were dated by scholars as of the pre-Christian era. These scrolls were as follows: a commentary, or as it was later called, midrash, on the book of Habakkuk, a complete Isaiah scroll, and another scroll which was later named the Manual of Discipline. An account was given of the discovery in the Biblical Archaeologist of September 1948. In the same number was printed a facsimile page on the commentary of Habakkuk. I wonder if it was published on September 11th. Just a thought. When I examined this facsimile, I noticed that the phrase Mora Zedek, or teacher of righteousness, occurred in the commentary of Habakkuk. From general knowledge of the history of Hebrew literature, it is known that this term had been coined in the Middle Ages. Hence, I immediately launched my criticism of the opinion that this scroll belonged to the pre-Christian period. I furthermore said that if the term teacher of righteousness had been in vogue in the pre-Christian period, and even if it had been used merely by a dissenting group, it would surely have penetrated into Jewish and early Christian literature. The word righteousness occurs frequently in the apocryphal literature, but the phrase teacher of righteousness is never found there. Jesus, for example, was called teacher or good teacher, but never teacher of righteousness. The use of this phrase in the commentary indicates clearly that it could not have been written in the pre-Christian period. I also pointed out that no commentaries or midrashim were written on biblical books before the destruction of the Second Temple. To this I added that other words and phrases found in the commentary of Habakkuk indicate clearly that it belongs to the Middle Ages, and that the author himself made use of the Targum of Jonathan, which itself is a compilation belonging to the Middle Ages. This was my first attack upon the opinions of the scholars. The war, however, soon proved to be one-sided. The scholars have never answered me by refuting my arguments. The best they could contend was that possibly the terms were in use in the pre-Christian period. This, to my mind, was an admission that they had not mastered the field of the history of Judaism and were not competently acquainted with Hebrew literature. Now, what I would like to add, some may have noticed that he is already using, for instance, when he starts talking about the Second Temple period, the Christian era, he is absolutely pulling from popular establishment literature, especially when he starts talking about things like destruction of the temple. That is specifically Josephine, and again, zero evidence that Josephus existed before a few centuries ago. And I would say, honestly, it's about the 1600s, I believe, was the earliest I could find any claims of its existence. And you have to remember that the tradition of Josephus is that it existed first in French, because I wanted to say Latin, but I think French, and which is just a Latin dialect, and was translated from that into Koine Greek, as bizarre as that is, because it's claimed that it existed In Koine Greek, though, I don't know that they have any purported original manuscripts. I think the Koine Greek was either a translation from the French, because I'm trying to do this actually just by memory, was either a translation from the French to Koine Greek, or the Koine Greek manuscript actually showed up later. So this is just an example of how he himself is using establishment pieces of literature to prove or disprove claims, again, claims made by really just organs of the establishment. You can see a great example of this if you can find, which you can pretty easily on his BitChute at least, and I actually think it's on his YouTube as well. Years ago, Eric Dubé did maybe a 2-hour, mostly editing of like Acharya S. and other scholars talking about the non-historicity of Jesus. I think he called it Jesus Never Existed. The thing is, throughout the entirety of that video, Eric Dubé himself, and really all the scholars that he edits in, they're all using establishment literature to disprove a claim also, brace yourself, a claim also by establishment parties. The best way to control the opposition is if we lead it ourselves. He goes on. The American Schools of Oriental Research in 1950 published the Isaiah manuscript. It was acclaimed as of great importance, and it was stated that it would revolutionize our knowledge of the Bible. Some even maintained that this very scroll was the same book of Isaiah from which Jesus had read when in the synagogue at Nazareth. Another theologian ventured the opinion that John the Baptist might have handled this scroll of Isaiah. In one of his sermons, he declared, "Isn't it a wonderful thing that the oldest Old Testament record of the prophecy of Isaiah may have been handled by the herald of the Messiah?" The importance of the scroll, because of its great antiquity, was well advertised in popular writings as well as on the air. Again, after examining the scroll, I became convinced that it was not of great antiquity and hence was valueless for the history of the Hebrew Bible. The scribe who copied the scroll did not even know sufficient Hebrew and therefore committed gross errors. Not only letters, but even entire verses are missing. The fact that the Machtemes lectiones were used in the scroll of Isaiah indicates clearly that this scroll could not have been written in the pre-Christian period, since the Machtemes lectiones were introduced in the biblical books by the authority of R. Akiba, who lived in the 2nd century of our era. Let me take a quick moment to just clarify Machtemes lectiones. So, Latin term, and essentially it's a Latin term translating as mother of language. And so that you can understand what the issue is, and this is an issue that I encounter on a linguistic level when I'm dealing with what did the original language really say before the Masorah and all the Nakud and all that. The popular story is essentially that all of the manuscripts that we know of in Hebrew, if they haven't directly had the Masorah applied to them. So the Masorah consists of a lot of different things. It consists of breaks for verses and chapters. These breaks can be very subtle or they can be very deliberate. There are pericopes, which are sections meant to be read on like certain days of the year. Those are oftentimes applied. There are cantillations that are often applied for singing. There are, of course, the Nikudot, which are all of those dots and dashes that are supposed to aid in pronunciation, but what they do, in fact, is typically they aid in lexicography, making the exact same words into various different words. And sometimes the concordance makers, the lexicon makers, and the translators, even after this, further parsed out even some of the words that were kept the same with the Nikud, and sometimes they put back together some of the words that were not, because this is something, in my opinion, that happened over a very short period of time, probably in the century that we call the 1800s. And then it was only solidified in the early 1900s. The Machtemes lectionis is this idea that various scribes inserted certain letters, as they call them, into the text to aid in pronunciation. Even that idea, of course, doesn't carry weight with me. If they were using Nikud, all the dots and dashes, you wouldn't need these inserted letters. Now, what I've seen on my own, I believe that there still exists a number of occurrences of this Machtemes lectionis in the text, because if not, then there are certain vowel anomalies, and sometimes, at least in the case of N and T, those letters, or Nun and Tav, they're somewhat anomalous. Now, oftentimes they are, experts in Hebrew language will give you reasons for them existing, like a verb that's reflexive might have this middle Tav or T in it. But more often than not, there isn't explanations for the insertions of the Vav or U and the Yod or Y. Now, I've considered for a long time the possibility that because of me creating the exhaustive Obri biglyphs roots table, which I'm currently recreating right now in a form that I think is far, far superior than what I was working on before. What I'm seeing is patterns of, mostly, if there's two consonants, and there are some consonants that are exceptions to this rule. This is just a sort of majority rule. If there are two consonants, let's say, we'll take D and R, which oftentimes D and R together, der, is used for like a generation of people, like, your children, the next generation, D, R, der. But it'll often appear as D, U, R. And sometimes you can find it in the text as D, Y, R. Now, that's either examples of this Machtemes lectionis, or those glyphs are inserted between those consonants to possibly indicate, if not the tense of the word, let's say they're mostly inserted into words that are mostly used as things or nouns. They could be indicating certain aspects to them. What aspects, I don't yet fully understand, because the U, if you look at the U or the Vav or the Wa, depending on which expert you ask, as far as how it's pronounced, and some pronounce it even more like an F. If you look at its most common use that seems to make the most sense, it seems like it tends to act as, either at the beginning of a word or a phrase, a sort of connector like a conjunction, perhaps to start out sentences or statements or clauses. And it's also used sometimes to include subjects or nouns, or I should have said objects or nouns, within a list of objects or nouns. Sometimes it seems to occur at the end of words that tend to be verbs, and the use for it at the end of those verbs isn't as clear. It also will occur at the end of nouns as a pronoun, possessive, his, something. So it's not as though these glyphs are not meaningful. They're meaningful. The U or Vav is meaningful, as is the Yod or Y, and the Nun or N. It's just that the way that they occur. I'll give you another good example. So that the word for man in the Hebrew Bible typically is Aish. So A-Y and Sh, what they call Shin. Aish, A-Y, Sh. But oftentimes you see this other word that they say, well, that's not the word for the title man. That's actually a word that's just indicating the gender. Sometimes they'll actually translate it as mortal. And that's Anush. A-N instead of Y, Sh. Or A-N-U, Sh. It's so similar, but it has that middle N. Now, there's other times that this happens too, and it's very weird to figure out how it's working. They say that the word for daughter is bet or B, and T or Tav. Just those two, bet for daughter. But when you put an N between them, it's often translated as daughters in the plural, and they call it a feminine plural. Benut or Bennett without the U between the N and the T. These are strange anomalies. And so I'm not 100% convinced that those are this matres lectionis, and that really this term matres lectionis isn't just a way to detract from certain items in the original grammar of this language that they would like to draw our attention away from. Obviously, Masoretic Hebrew rules are some of the most inconsistent linguistic rules that exist. There's no reason to take them seriously. There's every reason to take the malicious intent behind them seriously, but not to take these rules seriously. So I had to add that long explanation of matres lectionis in there so you can understand when he brings it up again, what he's referring to. Their idea, the official story, is that there were vowels often inserted in which to help pronunciation. At this point in time, I can't absolutely prove that A or what they would call aleph or E, what they would call he, or even O, which is O is like the oddball of the vowels in Obri. And I really hate to even group it with these others. I almost hate to group the A and the E with the U and the Y, just because of how common the U and the Y are and the A and the E aren't. But it's possible. However, those things being inserted, the only possibility I'm willing to lend may be what they are. Instead of being matres lectionis, they are a word that meant to put the A or the E in between two so-called consonants. And what we should be looking at is a root at the end of that starts with an A or starts with an E. I hope I've explained that a bit as far as the official story of matres lectionis as compared to what I myself have experienced and what I suspect. Okay. So I'll kind of start there at the end of that sentence. So even the physical appearance of the writing of this scroll indicates that it was written during the Middle Ages. When the scribe who copied it discovered he had made an error, he drew a line through the word to indicate that it was written by mistake, and he wrote the correct word above. The method of drawing a line through the letter or word to indicate that it was written by mistake came into vogue quite late. The third scroll the Manual of Discipline, was published by the American Schools of Oriental Research in 1951. This scroll, too, was heralded as one of the oldest documents which has come down to us from the pre-Christian period. The commonly accepted opinion of the scholars was that it was a document of the Essenes because there are parallels between ideas held by them as stated by Josephus and those found in the scrolls. Again, this Josephus topic is a very sore spot. You have to understand so many assumptions about so-called ancient life, ancient people, ancient geography, history, Josephus. And Josephus is so loaded with problems, just like all the other accepted establishment historians. When you encounter these people who talk about history as though it's such a well-documented fact, they are, in fact, absolutely full of shit. Because what they need to do, and they are everywhere, we're not talking about just academics. We're not talking about just scholars and people in that field. We're talking about pop culture, because that's where you plant the seeds, water them, grow them, turn them into great hulking trees that are immovable, is through pop culture mediums. Those are the people who are constantly treating this bullshit as though it should be taken seriously as history. And as I've said many times, and I have considered many times simply doing readings of some of these, like the towers of established history, like Herodotus, so that you can witness how ridiculous sounding the situations are, the languages, the claims are. They literally have the gall and the nerve to treat these things as though they should be taken seriously, when simply just by their form, their language, and the claims made within them speak volumes of how silly they are, how unserious we should take them. And even though you have voluminous works out there, such as Gibbon, other German scholars, they're based on all of these. I am being redundant by saying voluminous works. They're based on these often absolutely ridiculous quasi-historical, so-called historical books and manuscripts. Many of them, by the way, that have anything to do with Palestine, the Jews, Rome, absolutely the Essenes, the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty. It all goes back to this Josephus. So I'll continue with Zeitlin. Some scholars were of the opinion that this scroll would shed light on the origin and beginnings of Christianity, and therefore held that it was of great value both for the history of the Second Jewish Commonwealth and the origins of Christianity. In rebuttal against the claimed antiquity of the scroll, I pointed out that phrases used and ideas recorded in it were not known before the destruction of the Second Temple. I also pointed out that the cardinal ideas of the Essenes, as well as those of the Christians, were not referred to in it, such as immortality of the soul, reward and punishment after death, and resurrection. Even the physical writing of the scroll indicates that it was written during a late period. The author, in quoting a biblical verse, used ellipses to indicate the omission of a word. The practice of using ellipses to indicate that a word had been omitted came into use quite late, and therefore proves another help to date this manuscript. Quite appropriate. However, look, I don't think that the people who did this, one, absolutely did it with any sort of a like a godlike sense about things. And some things wound up being put out there that were lesser than probably what they intended. One thing, however, there is also the idea, just like with putting out manuscripts that have varying claims or varying accounts of the same subject, that is a tactic. That is a tactic. Let's put it this way. Wilhelm Kiermaier, now, he breaks it down essentially to a formula. The formula being you have a claim in manuscript A counterclaim in manuscript B, and then oftentimes what you will have is a manuscript C that has a sort of resolution, or at least the inclusion of the account in manuscript A and B. He actually does this regarding he goes over this regarding the Synoptic Gospels in his book, The Falsification of the History of Early Christianity, which is currently being translated into English by people involved with the Obry Project. Hopefully, we can bring this to you very soon. There's a formula to all of this. So he goes on to say, it has been well recognized that the so-called Manual of Discipline shows great affinity with the Zedekite fragments which were found in Cairo, Egypt, and were later published by Dr. Solomon Schechter. It has been assumed that both were the work of the Essenes. I tried to reject this theory because in the scrolls we have halakot, or Jewish laws, which were enacted by the sages a long time after the destruction of the Second Temple. The 3 scrolls which the late Professor Sukenik bought from a merchant were published recently and included another Isaiah scroll, the Scroll of Hymns, and the Scroll of the Wars between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The last scroll was considered very important because it was believed to be of Essene origin and hence very important for the history of warfare during the Second Jewish Commonwealth. Again, I rejected this theory on the basis of internal evidence, since the laws therein referred to were not in vogue during the period of the Second Jewish Commonwealth, and we know definitely that they were enacted after the destruction of the Second Temple. All my argument, okay, right there, that claim, we know definitely. Why? How do we know definitely? Based on what? Based on establishment organs claiming that certain manuscripts and books or codexes were of early origin. That's what he's talking about. He's not using language like apparently and maybe and probably and it's said. That's the kind of language, if we're going to be responsible in this world of nothing but lies, that's the kind of language we have to use regarding essentially any claim, especially from establishment organs, which he does not do. All my arguments, which I based on unimpeachable proofs, were ignored and remain unrefuted. The reason for this, we may assume, is that the silence was an easy way out. In this volume, I point out 2 things. The authors of the scrolls were semi-literate persons who did not know how to express themselves accurately in Hebrew, and most of the modern scholars who dealt with the scrolls were unable to read text correctly. Hence, their translations are faulty. Furthermore, they show a lack of knowledge of the history of Judaism with its rich rabbinic and Karaite literatures. So Karaite literature, or Karaites, this is a sect of Judaism that is purportedly committed to only reading and following the Torah. So no Talmudic, no rabbinic literature, no Midrash, only the Torah. Now, furthermore, regarding what he says when he says that the transcribers or authors of the scrolls were semi-literate persons who did not know how to express themselves accurately in Hebrew. Yeah, I don't know about that. Maybe. If these scrolls are a hoax, let's just say, which I don't know that he's going there with this, because I've read a good deal of this, but not the whole thing. I doubt it. That's not usually the sort of territory that any sort of scholar who's going to be published by the Jewish Quarterly Review is going to take. He might criticize them. He might say that some joker, like he's doing here, he's saying that the authors were semi-literate. Yeah, I'm not too sure about them being semi-literate, because I don't think they would have been planted there. And I don't think an ancient people, let's say, would go through all the trouble to acquire the vellum and pay for the time. All time has to be paid for. Now, it may not be paid for in the way that we have to pay for time and effort and products today, but nothing is free. Do you understand? No energy is not free. Things are not free. When people try to make the argument, well, energy should be free. I mean, the air we breathe is free. I mean, water falls downhill for free. Well, not exactly. And here's the thing. It is not free to think up and create machines and techniques to harness energy. It is not free to put the kind of time. Maybe an apple tree grows for free. But if you want the best apples, and you don't want them eaten by worms and insects and other things, and you don't want them to get little diseases that make them very unpleasant, someone has to care for that apple tree. That time that they put in is not free. Please understand that. So when anybody comes along and says, I need to be compensated for the valuable time or valuable things that I've done, that is that person just being realistic. It is not them being some kind of a selfish person or a ghoul. It's just common sense. Somebody who thinks that everything should be free or every good thing should be free hasn't thought the whole thing through, or they're trying to perpetrate a con. So the thing is to create, for instance, the Great Isaiah Scroll or any of these other scrolls or documents or the wars between the sons of light and sons of darkness, any of that stuff costs. It would cost. And if we're trying to make the argument that this was done by some ancient people, the Essenes maybe, there's a cost involved with acquiring vellum, especially if this is in Palestine. Palestine is not a place known for great resources, especially things to write on. Whether you're going to do it on papyri or vellum or some type of pulp or paper stock, it doesn't really matter. They don't have any of it in abundant supply, you see. So if we're going to imagine they lived there, and I guarantee you Solomon Zeitlin's going to imagine they did, they would have to pay premiums for any of these writing materials. And a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls were vellum. So it's an animal skin of some sort. You have parchment, you have vellum, you have papyrus. These are different types of, and then your codexes might be on parchment, it might be different pulps, different writing materials, all of them not plentiful in Palestine. Expensive. And I don't know what sort of resources they would be controlling down there by the Dead Sea. What minerals? Are they bottling minerals? Are they digging trenches to little pools and separating puddles of the Dead Sea and letting that dry out and then getting the minerals and bottling them and selling them to somebody on the internet? Was that what the Essenes were doing? To make money in order to buy these materials to write on? And how about ink? where were they getting the raw materials to make their inks? Or where were they buying their inks, their quills, their writing materials? The things to make furniture, because typically when you write, you want to do it on furniture. You don't want to try to write on your leg. You don't want to try to write on your Essene buddy's back. Cost, cost, cost. So, if these were really Essenes and they were really writing really real stuff a couple of thousand years ago, they would be investing quite a bit in order to make these complete manuscripts and then to have foresight. Do you know a number of these actually were also discovered with copper scrolls? Copper scrolls that I don't think the uber hot and wet Dead Sea air completely patinaed. Those must have been really good clay containers they were stored in. Anyways, besides all of the expense of writing or just transmitting all of these texts, storage. They figured they'd have to store it. And who knows how long they would have stored it while they were hanging out before they suddenly disappeared. And I guess they disappeared in such a hurry that they couldn't take those things with them. And whoever made them disappear, did somebody make them disappear? They didn't think to search around where they were living and everything and find everything they may have had and confiscated it. Either which way, it would have been expensive to produce. And you don't tend to put idiots on the job when you're investing like that and you're serious, like the Essenes are supposed to be very serious about these things. You don't put an idiot on the job. You don't put somebody on the job who might be a bit illiterate. So we have a problem with that. If we want to believe these were Essenes or anyone else living around the Dead Sea, God, what a terrible place. Like one of the worst places you'd want to live, in a cave around the Dead Sea, or even near. Why you would think to store things there, you'd have to be... That was the guy who was probably stupid, not who was actually penning the scrolls. So that's option one, and that doesn't really wash. Option two is that these are entirely forged or fabricated, not forged, fabricated documents. Entirely fabricated documents. And if they were entirely fabricated documents, there is a whole process that document fabricators have to go through in order to make any of these given documents, no matter what they're on, are they on parchment, papyri, vellum, whatever, to make them look and seem old, to use certain types of inks and then other methods afterwards to give them that appearance of age, and then to store them, and then to get some shepherd boy who's not going to tell tales out of school in the right place at the right time, which I don't think this kid who was supposed to be there was ever there. It was just a story. But let's say somebody questioned him, and I think he ended up anonymous too. I don't think anybody ever questioned him. And that's a good thing too, because whoever he was, though I don't think he ever existed, if he did, he would have probably a hard time keeping his story straight, because there's no way a shepherd boy led his goats down to Qumran to feed them. And there's no way he found these because he was throwing rocks up in caves. Okay? So the second option is that they were total fabrications. And that being the case, whoever is setting up this entire fabrication is not going to have an idiot doing the writing. Okay? So there was actually an intelligent reason for these things being all screwed up. Now, one of those intelligent reasons would be so that scholars would have something to go back and forth about and argue about for a very long time. And maybe so that everybody would think, well, how much can you really trust the Bible? Look, there's all of these variations in these different texts that we found. I think that the Isaiah scroll was really, now the two, but mostly the Great Isaiah scroll, was that thing that was needed to add this weight and authenticity to the other things we're seeing, like commentary on Habakkuk, this other book that's mostly about certain types of halakhic kinds of laws, or as according to the Essenes, especially books like the War of the Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness, or books of the giants, that kind of garbage. The Isaiah scroll was mostly just to back that stuff up. And for all we know, all the so-called Great Isaiah scroll was one of the various manuscripts produced only a couple of centuries ago that simply never had a need to be used or passed around in a public way. It had already aged for many, many, many decades by the time they decided to give some attention and authenticity to this state of Israel they would be creating at that time. And it was just a great candidate for that. Because so many of the manuscripts that were produced, that we're aware of today, they would have had to have deliberately been produced by terrible scribes, oftentimes who had many variations in the text. It's hard to take them seriously, like this was a serious person doing a serious thing. If you just look at them, it's hard to take them seriously. Because you have to think, what they didn't have the ability to take some sort of a ruler and make light ledger lines for their writings, because they're terrible. Now, a lot of them have their columns relatively straight, but just the nature of their lettering and sometimes the way things are smashed together, pulled apart, presented, terrible penmanship. It's just, again, it's hard to take them seriously as these were serious rabbis or serious scribes or serious scholars committing a serious act. Now, continuing. 2 other scrolls supposedly discovered by Bedouins were heralded by the press as of paramount importance for the history of the Jews. One was a phylactery, which it was claimed had been used by the men of Bar Kokhba, and the second was a letter written by Bar Kokhba himself. Again, as if this Bar Kokhba ever actually existed. In this volume, I show that this phylactery is according to the Babylonian tradition and belongs to the Middle Ages, and that the letter could not have been written by Bar Kokhba since it begins with the preposition from and a signature with his title appended. In antiquity, letters did not carry a signature at the end, and the title of the sender was placed in the beginning. No letter ever began with the preposition from. The scholars who maintain that the scrolls had been written in the pre-Christian period base their contention on paleography and archaeology. Paleography, as I view it, cannot be a criterion on which to decide the antiquity of the scrolls, since there are no scrolls in existence dating from the pre-Christian period with which to compare the recently discovered, in quotes, discovered manuscripts. Now, that's interesting that he would be implying these things, so-called discovered. What's also interesting, if I can go back to Kammeier, is Kammeier actually spends a good little bit of time talking about the problems that we have with, for instance, paleography and archaeology. The views of Albright, Berenbaum, Cross, and Trevor on Hebrew paleography cannot be considered scientific because they never undertook seriously the study of Hebrew orthography, handwriting. I'm sorry, just for anybody who doesn't know what these various things are. Orthography being handwriting. Paleography essentially is sort of the study of older texts and the writing of those texts, just for anyone who's not entirely familiar with what he's talking about. You know, a lot of people that are writing scholarly works, they're going to use terms that may be less and less and less and less people, or specialist terms. So I'm sorry if Most people listening to this understand what those things are. I just want to clarify just in case. One cannot deal with Hebrew paleography without first making a thorough study of Hebrew orthography. I append herein a facsimile of a Babylonian manuscript of the early part of the 10th century of the Christian era, wherein some of the letters were written in a more archaic form than those in the scrolls. Archaeology cannot serve as a criterion for the antiquity of the scrolls. And let me add this one thing. Now, okay, again, him going back to saying, well, I provide examples of various scrolls or examples of orthography from the 10th century. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with that. Here's the problem with paleography and orthography. Here's the problem with archaeology. Here's the problem with, let's say, anybody dating any structures, any buildings, from any place at any time. It all goes back to the fact that they're not doing this based on any sort of concrete, definitive, scientific, physical, scientific, absolute proofs. None of it. Absolutely none of it. They're going based on what somebody at some point deems as a standard. Let's just take, for instance, bricks. Okay? We can boil this down to the same sort of logic. Somebody will say, well, that structure there, it is from this era. And then in parentheses, the era, let's say the era is from the 1700s to the 1750s. Let's just say. And what they will give as examples, they'll say, because those bricks were made in such and such style, such and such size, from such and such clay, and we know that those bricks with those said features were, of course, only produced by such and such from this time to this time. It's not something based on sheer physical properties or absolute experiments that can be done to show us that, yes, this could only be this old, and so therefore we need to believe that this building is a couple hundred years old, and that's it. That is not how they do things. They do things based on claims that somebody at some point in time said that such and such has to be from such and such era because it has such and such characteristics. That's it. That's absolutely it. And if we have to go back to bricks real quick, just for one moment, some will go even further and say, well, we know that these bricks were produced at such and such time because they have a stamp on them of who produced them. And we know that this company existed in this place at this time, which is very, very interesting because there are some bricks in some structures that seem very old that have a certain stamp. That stamp may be a word or a name or some sort of indication of something, whatever it is, which is perfectly fine. They'll put those usually on a lot of bricks. They don't have the holes in the middles. They actually are just scooped out. And the stamps will be in let's say, that scoop. And what a lot of people don't understand is, for one thing, most of those companies, they say, existed and made those bricks at that time don't exist anymore and haven't for a very, very long time. So then we have the problem of, did that company even exist, or did it exist then? One. Two, most of these bricks happen to be, again, I'll do the air quotes, just like Zeitlin did, discovered by, well, let's say less than solidly believable parties. This is the same case with Palestinian and Levantine archaeology. Who discovered them again exactly? Is the discoverer of them, are they a character who might have had a very close financial relationship with, for instance, the Royal Society or the Royal Geographical Society? Did they go on to have a noteworthy career in politics after that? Were they given a nice, cushy position as some sort of foreign ambassador, where they just soaked up the sun, did very little in another country for the rest of their lives after these so-called discoveries? There tends to always be weaknesses in these arguments if we just take that little bit of time just to pick away at some of the alleged facts and details that they give us. Now, Zeitlin continues, archaeology cannot serve as a criterion for the antiquity of the scrolls. The 7 scrolls were not discovered by archaeologists. As if that would be far weightier. Then that's a funny thing. If we would read Abu al-Hajj's work, we would see some of the problems even with things discovered by bona fide archaeologists. But he says they weren't discovered by archaeologists. They did not actually see the scrolls wrapped in linen and secreted in jars. And here's the thing, folks. You didn't actually see those supposed bricks stamped by the supposed brick makers who they say made them at a certain time. You didn't see any of these things unearthed. You didn't see any of these things supposedly discovered. You weren't there when, Flinders. You weren't there when Flinders Petrie found the great ancient hieroglyphics written on the inside of the temple walls. You weren't there. Keep that in mind. You weren't there. Somebody else was, who is typically juiced in one way or another to these agencies like royal societies, in America, oftentimes military organizations, making these discoveries, making these surveys. You weren't there. I wasn't there. Nobody who we could actually trust, that we actually know, personally know, was there. He goes on, the accounts relating to the discovery itself of the scrolls are contradictory. I recount below the diverse and various accounts of the discovery, which are indeed stranger than fiction. I deal also with the well-advertised test called carbon-14, which is good. More people should deal with carbon-14 dating. The consensus of opinion among those who cling to the view that the scrolls belong to the pre-Christian period is that they were written by the Essenes. We shall demonstrate in the volume that this opinion must be discarded, since the ideas and laws set forth in the scrolls are in direct contradiction to those held and promulgated by the Essenes, or, as a matter of fact, by any Jewish group of the pre-Christian period. One thing I do want to add, by the way, regarding carbon-14 dating. In any of these kinds of dating that they say give us any kind of reasonable assurance of when something might have been created or produced or grown or anything else. Listen, when I was a complete ignoramus, before I really started asking any of these questions whatsoever, this is like back in my 30s, I was taking college courses because I thought I might be able to go and get a degree again. That's before I forgot that I was still very lost, and I was never going to be able to stay that course, especially academically, and be able to swallow that shit. I guess I had just been out of school too long to remember vividly all of the problems I had with everything they tried to teach me in school. Anyways, I took physical science class. This was one of the prereqs. we did have a term project. The term project we had to do is we had to make a presentation on some sort of scientific topic that we had at least discussed or gone over in some way or another in the text for that semester. Now, we had actually gone over carbon-14 dating, and of course, I had heard this from Christian points of view regarding how old the world was and all of that stuff. So that's where I was coming from at that time. But I made a presentation and found a very more than adequate amount of material that called heavily into question the idea of carbon-14 dating and its accuracy, and that's what I did my presentation on. I actually got an A. I got an A on that presentation, and the thing is, I don't think everything that I found was super strong, but I found enough to cast a lot of doubt on the veracity of carbon-14 dating. Just a first-year physical science student. Zeitlin goes on, many Christian scholars who have been devoting themselves to the study of the scrolls have maintained lately that they will revolutionize our knowledge of the beginnings of Christianity. Some have advanced a view that the teacher of righteousness was a prototype of the Messiah, Christ, and that he was put to death by the Jewish king Aristobulus II. Jesus, therefore, was a reincarnation of the teacher of righteousness. Thus, Christianity is denied any originality. The theological and scholarly world was recently aroused by press dispatches from England purporting to report radio talks by Mr. Allegro of the University of Manchester. Allegro, in his radio talk, is supposed to have said that the teacher of righteousness was crucified by Alexander Jannaeus, the father of Aristobulus II, and that when the king left, the disciples returned, took down the body of their teacher, and settled down to await his return. These pronouncements created a fervor among the theologians. The uniqueness of Jesus was at stake. As a matter of fact, some Christian liberals, basing themselves on the theories of DuPont Summers and now on the statements of Allegro, dared to maintain that Jesus was not unique and therefore not divine. I was highly skeptical and incredulous of these assertions attributed to Mr. Allegro, since I know from my studies of the history of the Second Jewish Commonwealth that at the time of Alexander Jannaeus, there had been no Jew who claimed himself to be a Messiah. Indeed, the idea of messianism had not yet penetrated Judaism. The apocalyptic Pharisaic sect, which originated the idea of a Messiah as a supernatural person, and which were forerunners of Christianity, came into being after the time of Alexander Jannaeus. In order to verify the accuracy of the press reports attributed to Mr. Allegro, I asked the British Broadcasting Company to be kind enough to send me a transcript of the 3 lectures delivered by Allegro on the 16th, 23rd, and 30th of January 1956, and they complied with my request. One thing, real quick. Whoever came up with this idea of the Messiah being a supernatural being did it entirely absent of Old Testament proof. I have gone through the occurrences of Meshik, Sha, like the Shin, Msyk, Mashik, and I'm telling you, none of the occurrences of that word have anything to do with any sort of supernatural being. These are all men that they're referring to. Absolutely men of different kind. It can be a man who's a Levite. It can be a man who is a kin, K-E-N, what the Jews call a Kohen. It can be a king. It can be one simply established as a judge to do a certain thing or task, but never a supernatural denotation to this Messiah. He goes on, after receiving the transcripts of Mr. Allegro's talks, I found that he had been correctly quoted in the press. Mr. Allegro said in his second lecture that many Jews, whom he defines as our sect, had fled from Jerusalem. The exodus, he declared, quote, was original and led by a priest whom they called the teacher of righteousness. Hardly a decade after they had established themselves in their simple buildings at Qumran, close quote, he continued, quote, I'm not always going to put the quotes in. Sometimes if I think that maybe they are valuable so that you can differentiate one voice from the other, I will. But many times I won't, simply because you typically can as a listener. And you don't need me to keep putting quote in. It's a little bit harsh to continue to put in quote and closed quote. Anyways, he continues, the man he's quoting, Allegro, the terrible Gennaeus, the wicked priest, as they called him, stormed down to their new home, dragged forth the teacher, and, as now seems probable, gave him into the hands of the Gentile troops to be crucified. Closed quote. He further asserted that the members of the community took down the broken body of their master to stand guard over it until the judgment day. If all these statements which Allegro made were indeed found in the scrolls supposedly discovered near the Dead Sea, the Christian theologians had genuine reason to become disturbed, because this would make Jesus merely an echo of the teacher of righteousness. As a matter of fact, his colleagues of the Palestinian Archaeological Museum at Jerusalem, who themselves are priests, became very fearful of the consequences which might be caused by Allegro's statements. They sent a letter to the London Times, which was published March 16th of 1956, wherein they denied the allegations made by Allegro. They said, there are no unpublished texts at the disposal of Mr. Allegro other than those which the originals are at present in the Palestine Archaeological Museum. We are unable to see in the texts the so-called findings of Mr. Allegro. We find no crucifixion of the teacher, no deposition from the cross, and no broken body of their master to be stood guard over until Judgment Day. Mr. Allegro replied to the accusations of his colleagues and sent me a copy of the letter which he forwarded to the Times, wherein he admitted that his statements were based on inferences. He said, any such reconstruction must of necessity be based largely on inference. He further maintained, years ago it was suggested by scholars that the teacher was expected to rise again as the priestly Messiah. I really hope that this is a great illustration of how much leeway these men with letters after their names, these men who are called scholars and who are called academicians, absolutely how much leeway they're given until they're pressed. Now, it doesn't matter if they're pressed by some joker like me, right? But when they're pressed by, let's say, somebody also with letters after their names, like Solomon Zeitlin presses them, oh, well, all of a sudden, they have to provide an answer. And in this case, of course, all of the evidence they say of the parallels between this teacher of righteousness and Jesus, he then has to go on to admit are inferences. Zeitlin continues, upon carefully examining the transcripts of Mr. Allegro's talk, I have concluded that his statements are purely fanciful and that we may stamp them as inventions. Alexander Gennaeus is not mentioned in the scrolls at all. Father DeVoe and his associates were right when, in the above-mentioned letter, they said that there is no mention in the scrolls of a teacher who was crucified by Alexander Gennaeus. From the reading of the transcripts of Mr. Allegro's talk, it is clear that he based some of his assertions on the fragment of a scroll which the Palestinian Museum bought from a Bedouin in 1950 and which was published by D. Barthélemy and J.T. Millick in Qumran Cave 1. It is further evident that he misunderstood the Hebrew text when he said that this scroll contains doctrines and phraseology strikingly reflected in the New Testament. In the following pages, I have endeavored to demonstrate that this scroll was composed sometime before the Kiritic period. Again, the Kirites and the Kiritic period are people who purport to follow only the Torah. I do not believe that the entire blame for sensationalism and falsification of history by misrepresentation of the Hebrew text of the scrolls should be placed on Mr. Allegro. He merely followed suit. All the writers who assumed the antiquity of the scrolls did not support themselves on historical evidence, but based their conclusion on inferences. In many instances, they misunderstood the Hebrew text. The blame should rest on them. Their assertions about the Essenes and the teacher of righteousness are not based on any documents. And that is where Mr. Zeitlin puts a break in his introduction. So that's actually where I am going to wrap this part up. At the risk of just sounding like a broken record, let's just acknowledge that Zeitlin, he's just transferring blame from one respected scholar, one guy with letters after his name, to other purported scholars, other men with letters after their name. These people, and if we want to include medical doctors in the whole mix, they get away with tremendous amounts of fraud in statements that they make that are at best theoretical. Some of them get away with, you fill in the blank. You know the expression. So, as we go through this, as surprising as it is that this Solomon Zeitlin writing for this Jewish Quarterly Review has already put things like discovery in quotes. Now that's pretty strong, and I have to believe that in part it's because this was written in the 50s. Most people don't understand that the level of propaganda and mind control and programming of the Western world, and that's who he's writing to here. He's writing to people in the Western world. He's writing to Christians of the Western world. That's what this book is for. This book is not specifically for Jews or Jewish scholars or just scholars. He's writing to people in the Western world, Christians. The levels of propaganda on peoples of the West, specifically the common man of the West, after World War II were in insane levels. They were huge. So it's going to be very interesting to see how he plays this out, because he's already made claims herein that aren't common today. This is not really where scholars go today, making claims like that. Literally calling discoveries so-called discoveries. Now, I'm guessing, not knowing exactly who he's going to try to pin that on, or if he even mans up and does. But I would assume that if he does, it's going to be on the Bedouins, right? Because here's the one thing. No matter what, scholars, academics will appear to argue and make accusations all the day long But at the end of the day, they do have certain talking points, like, for instance, 2,000 years since this Jesus, medieval period dating. We know that, you see, he's still making these sorts of statements. They stick together like glue on these certain sacred cows that they're not going to deviate from, and it would be a shock if he did. It's already a big deal that he is doing things like calling into question whether these were actual discoveries. Really interested to see where he goes with that. And to tell you, since I've read a lot of this book already, he does cite big problems with a lot of these texts, some that we've already seen. We can either take the evidence that he provides, which is pretty much all establishment evidence, and that should cause us to question these things, or we can go deeper, further with the commentary that I provide, the very unique commentary that I provide on any of these matters regarding whether we can really trust any of these very strong sacred cow establishment talking points. So with that, I'm going to conclude part 1 of this reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Modern Scholarship by Solomon Zeitlin. I will pick it right back up where we stopped in part 2 of this. I want to once again thank all of those who are my patrons, those who donate to what I'm doing and trying to do. All of your donations and all of your help me to make stuff like this, as well as documents, and will help me to continue to make more as time goes on. So thank you again for what you do, and I'll see you in the next one.